Hey guys, tonight, we're going to a Viking feast, but not just any feast. This one ends a king's reign, his life, and perhaps even his legend. Picture it a roaring longhouse somewhere along a frozen Norwegian fjord, firelight flickering off iron helmets and fur-lined cloaks. Outside the wind howls across ice and pine, but inside there's music, laughter, and the smell of roasted boar and honeyed mead. It's warm, it's loud, it's glorious, and you probably won't survive this party. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed, let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins in the late 10th century when frost-rimmed longships still carved the grey waters of the North Sea, and every coastline seemed just a little afraid of the dragon-proud sails that might appear at dawn. Somewhere along Norway's ragged coast, scholars debate whether it was in Trøndelag or Hålogaland, a powerful Viking king named Harald Greycloak ruled with iron ambition and a fondness for both poetry and blood. He had the look of someone carved from oak, tall, broad-shouldered, a beard the colour of weathered iron, and eyes that seemed to remember every insult ever spoken. Harald had united much of western Norway under his banner, but peace never sits easily among Vikings. Rival jarls to the south murmured rebellion. Danish envoys whispered promises of gold if someone could adjust the Norwegian throne. Harald himself had sent more than one rival to meet Odin prematurely, sometimes in the field, sometimes during suspiciously overgenerous feasts. But as with all ambitious men, Harald's circle tightened. Friends became flatterers, flatterers became plotters, and plotters learned to smile with their teeth. He had survived raid sea battles and the deadly politics of kinship, yet it wasn't a sword that would end his reign, it was supper. One winter, Harald declared a grand feast to celebrate what he claimed would be the last uniting of the North before eternal peace. It was an odd phrase for a man who'd rarely made peace with anyone. But the winter had been brutal, food scarce, and morale low. His heralds spread the invitation far and wide. Jarls, seers, mercenaries, poets, even old enemies were welcome. Bring gifts, bring songs, bring your thirst. Now a mainstream historical fact, Viking kings often used midwinter feasts called jolablå, a mix of banquet and sacrifice to reaffirm loyalty and distribute wealth. These events could last several days, featuring contests, poetry, sacrifices to the gods, and enough ale to float a small ship. It was part celebration, part surveillance. A drunk jarl tends to reveal where his loyalties truly lie. But this particular feast was different. The invitations were carved on rune sticks, each one etched with the symbol of a serpent swallowing its own tail, the Jörmungandr world serpent of Norse myth. It was a symbol of eternity, but also of endings. Some said the rune carver hesitated before marking the king's own token, as though fearing to complete the circle. The quirky tidbit here among the invited was a skald named Tormund the Red, famed for reciting sagas backward when drunk. His poems were said to be prophetic when recited in reverse, though that might have been the mead talking. Still, people listened, because in those days poetry and prophecy were dangerously close cousins. As the guests travelled north, the weather grew stranger. Snow fell in sheets one moment and melted the next. Fishermen claimed they saw lightning under the sea. Ravens gathered in the trees, black feathers bright against the snow. Odin's scouts muttered an old shield maiden travelling with the convoy, counting who will die. When the guests finally reached the king's hall, it loomed like a ship run aground on the mountain's flank beams of pine, so massive they might once have been masts. Smoke rose from the roof vents, carrying the smell of pine tar roasted meat, and something faintly metallic like iron left too long in snow. Inside, preparations were nearly complete. Servants hurried with barrels of ale and mead, stacking them beside tables draped in rough woven cloth. The hearth in the centre blazed with an oak log thicker than a man's waist. Above it hung iron cauldrons bubbling with stew that could feed 100 warriors. Shields gleamed on the walls, catching the firelight in shifting patterns of red and gold. Harald himself stood at the head of the hall watching. He wore a cloak of wolf fur and a ring of silver on each finger. His face was carved into a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Some say he looked like a man celebrating victory. Others say he looked like someone attending his own wake. Historians still disagree whether the feast was meant as a diplomatic gesture or a trap. Some sources, mostly sagas recorded centuries later, claim Harald planned to poison his rivals. Others suggest his Danish enemies orchestrated the banquet to eliminate him. One wild theory argues that a sorcerer from Jutland placed a curse on the mead itself, ensuring the king's doom. Whatever the truth, everyone came. Nobles from Iceland, merchants from the Orkneys, even a wandering monk from the south, whose Latin prayers went mostly ignored. The longhouse swelled with noise, the smell of sweat and ale mixing into something almost holy. And as the sun vanished behind the peaks, torches were lit, horns were raised, and the first song began, a verse so old no one remembered its meaning, only that it had to be sung before the feast could begin. The king smiled, lifted his own horn, and toasted the hall. Tonight, he declared, we drink not to the past, but to the world yet to come. He drank deep. Around him, hundreds followed. Mead-spilled laughter rose, and the snow outside kept falling soft and silent, as if the mountain were already preparing to bury its secret. The night would end in ashes, but for now, the feast had only begun. The invitations went out like ripples on a dark sea carved into ashwood runesticks, smeared with soot, to make the grooves gleam black, and passed from hand to hand until rumour itself seemed to carry them farther than any messenger could. Each bore the mark of the serpent devouring its tail, and beneath it 3 words: come, feast, remember. No signature, but everyone knew whose hand guided the blade that carved them. It was a strange message from a man who had made as many enemies as Harold Greycloak. Some said he meant to forge unity before the spring raids. Others whispered it was bait away to gather his doubters in one place, where axes and accidents could settle the score. The winter sky had been heavy and grey for weeks, and people swore even the snow fell slower that year, as if waiting to see what would happen when all of Norway's restless wolves dined together. The runesticks reached Jarls in the south, berserkers in the mountains, and a few souls who should have known better. One of them was Jarl Sigtrygg of Rogaland, a man whose loyalty had never quite outweighed his appetite. He turned the invitation over in his hand, muttering, feasts and funerals are carved with the same knife. Still he went, because when a king invites you to his table, staying home can be far more dangerous. A mainstream historical fact, runesticks like these were genuinely used in the Viking Age for sending short messages or commands. Archaeologists have found dozens, some no longer than a man's finger, inscribed with names, warnings or charms. They were the emails of the 10th century, except deleting them usually meant burning the messenger. The roads to the north were choked with ice. Frozen rivers gleamed like veins of glass under the moon. Convoys trudged through snow that reached the knee, dragging sleds of mead venison and barrels of smoked herring. The sound of distant wolves travelled faster than the men. Somewhere between settlements, stories began to grow like frost tales that the feast was cursed, that Harold's ancestors had appeared in dreams demanding a blood sacrifice. One merchant swore he saw an omen, a halo of light circling the moon, glowing like an eye watching from the sky. It's the ring of the dead, said a priest travelling beside him, clutching his wooden cross tighter. Someone at that feast won't leave alive. The merchant laughed, but he slept with his knife under his pillow that night. Meanwhile, in the hall itself, preparations had turned into something between worship and warfare. Harold's servants polished the shields on the walls until they reflected the fire like molten gold. The cooks salted the boar meat in deep troughs, each piece weighing around 30 kilograms, or roughly 66 pounds. They brewed mead in great vats, mixing honey from the southern coast, with water drawn from a spring said to bubble over the bones of a giant. The quirky tidbit here, according to an obscure Icelandic saga, Harold's cooks included a woman named Brynhild the Brewer, who claimed to have tamed thunder in a barrel. Her secret recipe, she said, could make a man strong enough to arm wrestle a troll or forget his own name. Modern historians think she probably just used wild yeast and a dangerous amount of pine resin, but who knows? As guests arrived, heralds greeted them at the gates, taking offerings and measuring egos. Each name was shouted into the hall like a challenge. Sigtrygg of Rogaland, Einar, the red-handed Torhild skull splitter. The air thickened with heat noise and the sound of laughter, too sharp to be friendly. At the head of the long table, Harold raised his horn to each arrival, smiling his wolfish smile. He looked pleased, too pleased. Even those who liked him admitted that his cheer always seemed rehearsed, like a mask that didn't quite fit. Behind him, the royal seer, an old woman wrapped in sealskin, muttered over a bowl of blood. She dropped bits of bone into it, watching the patterns float. A feast for one realm, she whispered, and a grave for another. Historians dispute whether that seer ever existed. Some think she was added later by saga writers to give the story a mythic sheen. Others argue that Harold's court really did include a völva, a prophetess who practiced Seda, the old Norse magic of fate-weaving. Either way, her presence fits the pattern of Viking kings consulting prophecy before major events, just as they would check the winds before setting sail. The feast's rumour spread faster than the snow melt. Even monks in distant abbeys heard of it, scribbling in their chronicles about the northern king who dined with doom. In a small cloister near the coast, a scribe recorded a note in Latin. In nocte convivitur nitrum non auditor sed cor hominum tremit. On the night of the feast, no thunder was heard, but the hearts of men trembled. By the time the guests reached the royal longhouse, fatigue had blurred with anticipation. They saw the glow from miles away, a red crown of fire over the snow. It must have looked like Valhalla itself calling warriors home. Inside, servants hurried to seat each arrival, according to rank kings near the centre jarls, beside them skalds and warriors along the outer benches. The lower the bench, the closer you were to the dogs, and the dogs, by the smell of things, were going to eat well. The first horn of mead went round, and silence fell as Harold stood. His voice carried easily over the crackle of the fire. "Brothers," he began, "we gather not to plot or mourn, but to remember who we are. The sea made us, the storm forged us, and the gods, well, they're still deciding what to do with us." Laughter followed, though not all of it sounded sincere. Outside, snow continued to fall in thick, patient silence. Ravens perched along the roof beams, black against the smoke, as if they had come early for the aftermath. "Eat," the king commanded, raising his horn again. "Drink, before the gods remember they envy us." The guests roared approval. The first platters were carried in boar, glistening with fat heaps of bread and salt, whole fish roasted until their scales looked like silver coins. Somewhere near the back, the skald Tormund began to tune his lyre, muttering under his breath the refrain that had haunted him for days. A feast of peace, a night of knives. What none of them knew was that their names would soon be etched in more than runes, they'd be carved into legend. The hall roared with laughter, the mountain stayed silent, but somewhere beneath the snow the world's serpent stirred. The longhouse was alive that night, alive the way a fire breathes or a beast dreams. Smoke drifted through the rafters like slow-moving ghosts curling between shields hung in neat rows. Every plank seemed to shimmer with warmth and age, the timber darkened by centuries of feasting and fighting. The beams gleamed with a sheen of fat and gold leaf catching torchlight like sunlight trapped in wood. This was no rough gathering hall. It was a palace built by men who worshipped storms and measured power by how loudly their laughter could drown out thunder. The guests filled the benches in thick fur-clad rows, men from the fjords, warriors from the islands, traders from distant coasts where the tide spoke in different tongues. Their armour clinked softly under layers of wool and bear hide. Every movement sent up a puff of frost, because even with roaring fires, winter always found its way inside. The smell was overwhelming, boar roasting on spits, salted fish, charred bread, sweat and mead pine tar and smoke thick enough to make a priest question heaven. Harold sat at the high seat, the carved chair rising like a throne at the end of the hall. Above him hung the banner of his house, a grey wolf with red eyes stitched from silk brought by traders who claimed to have crossed the Caspian Sea. His hair, streaked with silver, glowed in the firelight as he turned his cup, slowly watching it catch reflections of the flames. Around him his thanes laughed too loudly, their cheer practised their eyes sharp. A mainstream historical fact, Viking feasts were carefully choreographed displays of wealth and dominance. Seating order, drink distribution, even the size of a guest's drinking horn spoke of rank. Archaeological finds in Norway and Denmark show longhouses up to 60 metres or about 200 feet long, with central hearths large enough to roast whole animals. Each plank of those halls held more than stories, it held politics. The first of many toasts came early. A great iron horn longer than a man's arm was filled with mead, and passed from hand to hand, its rim set with amber and bone. Each man who drank swore loyalty to the king, or at least acted like he did. Harold raised his own horn, his voice echoing above the din. To Odin, who gave us victory, to the sea that keeps our enemies cold. The hall erupted in cheers, cups, sloshing laughter, booming so loud it nearly shook snow from the roof. Near the king sat his brother Halfdan, quieter, broader, the kind of man who drank with both hands and thought before he spoke. His gaze moved from Harold to the guests' studying faces. Later legends would call him Halfdan the Watchful. He had reason to be. He'd seen too many smiles hide daggers. At the opposite end, Jarl Sigtryg was already 3 horns deep, his cheeks flushed, his beard dripping with foam. "Your mead," he shouted, to no one in particular could make a dead man sing. He laughed, and half the hall laughed with him, though none quite dared to stop first. The quirky tidbit, excavations of Viking drinking horns show that some were lined with beeswax or silver, to mask the sourness of reused mead. But Harold's hall had none of that thriftiness. His horns were carved from actual aurochs, extinct wild cattle so massive that their horns could hold nearly 3 litres, or just under 1 gallon of drink. It was said the king once challenged a guest to drain one in a single breath. The guest succeeded, but fainted immediately after. Harold declared him a hero and had him buried under the threshold so every guest who entered would step over the bravest drunk in Norway. Back in the hall, the fire popped and spat sparks that floated upward like tiny suns. A skald stood near the hearth, plucking a lyre and reciting verses older than the walls. His voice was hoarse from cold and smoke, but his words carried far tales of gods who traded eyes for wisdom, of heroes swallowed by serpents of kings who dined with fate and tried to bargain for dessert. The laughter faltered when he sang of treachery. Beware, he intoned, the hand that pours your mead, for it may stir the storm. Harold smiled thinly and tossed him a silver coin. Sing happier songs, the king said, before someone thinks you're a prophet. The hall obliged, drums began to thump. Someone near the hearth wrestled a bear pelt over their shoulders, pretending to be a berserker mid-frenzy. Laughter returned louder this time, because laughter is armour when the air grows too heavy. Historians can't agree on whether Harold's feast was held in his hall at Avildsen, or at a hunting lodge farther inland. Some claim sagas conflate several events, a royal banquet, a political summit, and a murder disguised as merriment. Yet fragments of burned timbers found near Rogaland show a great hall, destroyed by fire around the right decade. Its floor plan, 60 paces long, matches contemporary royal sites. Halfdan, the king's brother, leaned toward Harold. Too many toasts, he muttered. Too many smiles, Harold chuckled. Then drink until you stop worrying. You can't fear a storm when you're already drowning. Outside, the wind shifted. Snow swirled off the roofs like smoke escaping the mountain. The ravens still perched along the ridgepole, restless now, feathers ruffling in the updraft. Inside, the heat thickened. The fire crackled lower, torches hissed in their sconces, and sweat glistened on faces flushed from drink. The great doors had been closed hours ago to keep out the cold, sealing the air tight. Mead steamed in its cups. People laughed too loudly at things that weren't funny. One monk, the same who had arrived days earlier, still out of place in his woolen robe, leaned toward a servant and whispered, "In my land they call this sin." The servant, not missing a beat, replied, "Here we call it dinner." Somewhere near the far end of the table a horn was dropped. It clattered against the floor and rolled, spilling golden liquid across the rushes. Every eye turned to watch the mead seep toward the fire, where it hissed and flared bright green for an instant before vanishing. Someone muttered, "An omen." Someone else whispered, "A trick of pitch." The laughter resumed, but softer this time, nervous. Harold lifted his cup again. "Drink," he commanded, forcing his grin. The gods grow jealous if mortals fear their own luck. As the torches guttered and smoke wove through the rafters, the air itself seemed to lean closer, listening. The longhouse smelled of triumph, decay, and something new, like a storm waiting in the walls. And outside, beneath that wide northern sky, the snow began to fall harder, the flakes thicker, faster, until the hall looked from afar like a single golden ember inside a world of white. By the time the first horn of dawnlight touched the horizon, every guest inside would have sworn the same thing later, that for one heartbeat the laughter stopped. The fire dimmed and the king's shadow stretched across the table, longer than any man alive. The next horn of mead was raised with ceremony. Harold's cup shone in the firelight, rimmed with silver etched with the runes of his ancestors. The hall quieted. Even the hounds curled by the hearth seemed to sense that something solemn hovered above the smoke. To the gods, Harold declared, his voice booming off the beams. To Odin, who gave us wisdom through pain, to Thor, who guards us with thunder, to Freyr, who blesses our harvests and our beds, and to Njord, who keeps our ships from sinking faster than our patience. Laughter rippled through the benches, breaking the tension for a heartbeat. But then the laughter faded, and Harold's tone softened. And to those who cannot drink tonight, he said, "Our fathers, our sons, those who fell with swords in their hands, and those who wait in halls we can't yet see. May they drink before us and remember our names." Silence. Then the hall erupted with shouts of skald cups clanged. Mead splashed. It was both prayer and defiance, an attempt to outshout death. The torches seemed to flare in agreement. A mainstream historical fact, such toasts were an essential part of Blot, the Old Norse sacrificial feast that honoured gods and ancestors alike. They weren't just about drinking, they were ritual acts binding the living to the dead. Archaeological finds show horns and bowls deliberately buried under longhouse floors filled with mead or animal blood as offerings. The Vikings didn't separate the sacred from the social. Every sip was a handshake across worlds. As Harold drank, he felt the heat of the fire, the heavy pulse in his temples, and something else a flicker in the air as though the shadows had thickened. For a moment he thought he saw movement near the far end of the hall, a figure standing in the smoke, tall, indistinct, cloaked in grey. Then the figure was gone, swallowed by the torchlight. He blinked, shook his head and laughed it off. Too much mead, too many memories. But others saw it too. Halfdan's eyes darted to the same corner, and the old seer by the hearth muttered something under her breath, fingers tracing invisible runes on her palm. The quirky tidbit comes from later folklore people said that during that feast, the ghost of King Eric Bloodaxe, Harold's father, appeared among the guests. The tale goes that he stood behind his son's chair, silent, his spectral hand resting on Harold's shoulder, until the final toast was made. Of course, no archaeologist has ever found evidence of a ghost, but many sagas speak of the dead attending feasts when their bloodlines were at stake. It was less superstition and more family obligation. The music resumed, but quieter now. The lyre plucked a slow, mournful rhythm as Skuld Tormund the Red began another poem. His voice trembled as he sang of the god Balder, the Bright One, slain by treachery, mourned by gods and men alike. When he reached the line, "No feast is ever safe from shadows," his words cracked. The hall fell silent again. Harold broke it with a grin that looked almost defiant. Enough of sadness. The gods love a challenge, not tears. Let's show them how mortals celebrate while we still can. He snapped his fingers and servants rolled in a barrel larger than a man, sealed with pitch and carved with dragon heads. This, he declared, is the mead of victory, brewed 10 winters ago after our conquest of Holigoland. It has slept longer than most of you could hold your tongues. Let's wake it up properly. The seal was broken with an axe, and the scent that filled the hall was thick and sweet like honey and smoke. Cups were filled and passed down the line. Harold drank first, then Halfdan, then Sigtrig, then each man in turn until the hall was humming again. Historians still argue about what came next. Some sources claim the mead was poisoned, a Danish plot slipped into the casks years before. Others suggest ergot fungus, a hallucinogenic mould, had spoiled the honey, turning the feast into a nightmare. A few scholars dismiss it all as saga embellishment. Yet whatever happened, the tone of the night changed after that barrel was opened. Voices grew strange laughter, too sharp, faces too pale. The fire seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The air shimmered with heat despite the freezing wind outside. Someone at the far bench began muttering in Old Norse verse words of invocation, half prayer, half curse. Harold ignored it, raising his horn again. To victory, he shouted. To brothers, to every fool who thinks tonight won't be remembered 1,000 years from now. And then softly but distinctly a voice from the shadows answered him. It will be remembered. Harold Greycloak, but not as you think. The hall froze. Even the dogs lifted their heads. The voice was neither mocking nor kind. It came from nowhere and everywhere, low and measured like the sea speaking through wood. Halfdan stood hand on sword. Who said that the seer's bowl of blood trembled in her lap? Not living, she whispered. Not dead. Just listening. The fire snapped violently, sending sparks high into the rafters. A few guests laughed nervously, muttering that the mead had gone to everyone's heads. But Harold's smile had vanished. He looked toward the shadows again. Nothing. Only smoke curling like pale fingers along the walls. Outside, the wind howled once hard enough to rattle the doors. The sound was almost a reply. Inside, Harold exhaled slowly, forcing calm. If the dead wish to drink, he said, forcing a smile, then let them drink. They'll find our mead stronger than memory. The guests cheered, but the cheer was brittle now. Behind them, the seer rose to her feet, eyes unfocused. The cup is filled, she murmured. The price is due. Then she sat again as though her bones had turned to stone. And the night went on music, laughter, toasts, but the warmth never quite returned. Every Viking feast celebrated life, but this one was beginning to feel like a rehearsal for something else. Something waiting in the rafters, patient and invisible. The mead tasted sweeter. The shadows grew longer, and the hall, once roaring with voices, seemed to listen back. Outside, unseen beyond the thick wooden walls, the snow fell slower now, each flake drifting down as if reluctant to touch the earth. The next cup is poured with trembling hands, though no one admits it. The servants, pale from heat and exhaustion, move between benches with bowls of steaming meat and horns heavy with mead. The air is so thick with smoke that even the gold ornaments on the rafters look dull now, as if the hall itself has started to dim. Somewhere outside, the wind moans against the door like a warning that no one can quite hear, or perhaps chooses not to. At the high seat, Harold watches the refilling of his cup with a gaze too intent for a man at ease. He has seen battlefields, betrayals, and enough blood to know when silence becomes heavier than noise. He swirls the mead and studies its colour amber as sunlight through old honey. Stronger than last year's brew, he says lightly. Halfdan leans closer, voice low, or darker. The horn is passed down again, this time to the guests of highest rank. Each man takes a drink, wipes his beard, and forces a grin. But even the bravest warrior knows the oldest fear in the world, not the sword, not the storm, but the cup, offered by another's hand. A mainstream historical fact, poisoning in the Viking Age, though rare, was not unknown. The Volsunga saga mentions drink of death, mixed with serpent venom, and Norse law codes from Iceland include penalties for ale witchcraft spells, or toxins brewed into mead. Archaeologists have even found horn cups with traces of hemlock and henbane plants, known to cause hallucinations, paralysis, or worse. A hush falls as the cup reaches Jarl Sigtrygg. He lifts it high and laughs. To the king who feeds us so well will die fat and happy. The hall roars with laughter, but when he drinks he pauses mid-sip. His brow furrows. Bitter, he mutters. Too bitter. He slams the horn down. Has the brewer gone soft? The laughter fades. A servant stammers that it's the same brew as before. Sigtrygg glares, his face flushing, then paling. He opens his mouth to speak again, but instead a shudder passes through him. He grips the table eyes wide. Then just as quickly it passes. He lets out a long breath and forces a grin. Too much honey, he says hoarsely. That's all. But half the hall has stopped eating. Even the hounds grow restless, whining softly as if they smell something no one else can. The quirky tidbit appears here in one chronicler's later retelling. He claimed that Harold's hall contained a ceremonial horn called the Wolf's Throat, said to be carved from the skull of an aurochs, slain by Odin's lightning. Whoever drank from it, the legend went, would see their true fate reflected in the mead. Harold himself supposedly laughed at the story, saying if fate wants to show me my face, it had better bring a mirror. And yet as the cup comes round again, his hand trembles slightly. The seer, still seated near the hearth, begins to hum under her breath a low rhythmic tune. No one knows the words, but everyone feels them. The sound moves like a tide through the hall, brushing against the edges of reason. One warrior mutters that the air tastes of iron. Another swears he feels the ground shift beneath his boots. Harold drinks. The mead burns his throat sharper than before. The sweetness is gone. It tastes of smoke and salt as though it's been mixed with seawater. He sets the cup down, slowly, eyes unfocused. Stronger indeed, he murmurs. Halfdan watches him closely. Brother, he says quietly. Perhaps the gods have had enough to drink tonight. Harold laughs, though the sound is hollow. If the gods wanted me dead, they'd send a storm, not a brewer. But his skin glistens with sweat despite the cold. His breath comes uneven. Historians still debate whether the story of the poisoned horn has any basis in truth. Some argue that Harold's death, recorded vaguely in later sagas, was likely the result of betrayal during a feast possibly orchestrated by his rivals among the Danish kings. Others see the tale as mythic allegory, a symbolic punishment for pride, a northern echo of the Greek idea that hubris always demands payment. The hall itself begins to turn uneasy. The fires crackle louder. Shadows lurch across the walls as if restless. One of the guests, a monk from the coast, mutters a prayer under his breath, crossing himself repeatedly. The old seer opens her eyes for the first time in hours and whispers, "The drink remembers." Then something happens that none can later agree on. Some say a horn shattered mid-toast, spraying mead that steamed as it hit the floor. Others say the torches dimmed all at once, plunging the room into red twilight. But all agree that for one strange instant the king's cup glowed faintly from within, as though fire had taken root in the liquid itself. Harold stares into it, his reflection rippling. For a heartbeat he sees not his own face, but another's, a pale visage crowned with frost eyes bright as ice. The vision vanishes as quickly as it comes. He laughs too loud, shaking his head. "Drunk on ghosts," he says. "That's all." Halfdan's jaw tightens. Then the ghosts drink deep tonight. The seer's voice rises, suddenly stronger than before. The serpent feeds on its tail. The cup is turned. The king is crowned in his own ending. The room erupts, some guests laughing, others shouting, others gripping swords. The sound is chaos, echoing like thunder in the beams. Harold stands, one hand on the table, his eyes wild but clear. Enough, he roars. If there is poison in this hall, it's fear. If there is a curse, it's cowardice. Drink or let the snow bury your names. He drains the horn in a single swallow. The hall watches breathless. For a long moment nothing happens. Then the fire flares suddenly high, roaring like the sea. A gust of wind slams the doors open. The flames lean sideways, casting the king's shadow long black and writhing across the tables. Someone screams. Harold grips the edge of his throne, swaying. The mead horn slips from his hand, clattering to the floor. His gaze lifts to the roof beams where smoke curls like grey serpents. "Do you hear that?" he whispers. The oars. And then he collapses. The hall is silent. For a heartbeat, even the wind holds still. Halfdan kneels beside him, fingers pressed to his neck. His expression darkens. "He's gone cold," he murmurs, then softer, or perhaps he's gone somewhere warmer. The seer closes her eyes. The king has sailed. Outside, snow begins to fall again, slow, thick, unhurried, as if the sky itself has paused to watch. And far above the longhouse, the northern lights shimmer faintly green and gold, like a bridge for someone crossing to a place beyond storms and reason. For a long moment, no one breathes. The king lies slumped beside the high seat, his crown half tilted, the horn still spinning near his feet. The mead pooled around him gleams gold in the firelight, as if mocking the silence that follows. Then the first scream cuts through the stillness, a sound sharp enough to shatter the night. Halfdan rises to his feet, eyes wide and furious. "Get the physician," he bellows, though no one moves. What healer could do anything now? Harold's lips are pale, his chest unmoving. A hush spreads down the length of the hall. Men who once faced axes without flinching now stare into their cups, unwilling to meet the sight of a fallen king. The dogs begin to howl. That's when the wind changes. A single gust sweeps through the longhouse, bending the flames sideways, scattering embers into the rushes on the floor. For a heartbeat, the fire flickers blue, unnatural cold, and then it erupts upward, bright and roaring. "Water," someone shouts, though none is near enough. Buckets are overturned, ale splashes uselessly across the planks. The heat rises fast, searing the skin, curling the banners that hang from the rafters. The carved serpent emblem above the throne glows red as iron, its fanged mouth seeming to grin. Halfdan drags his brother's body back from the flames, the fur cloak smouldering in his grip. Out he roars, voice roar. "Everyone out!" The hall erupts in chaos, men pushing, stumbling, shouting. The great doors are thrown open and snow-laced air rushes in like a lungful of mercy. A mainstream historical fact, Viking longhouses with their tar-sealed timbers and open hearths were notoriously prone to catching fire. Archaeological digs at Borg and Leisure have revealed thick layers of charcoal, beneath later reconstructions evidence of more than one catastrophic blaze. But those fires usually came from lightning or carelessness, not as the later sagas claim, from divine retribution. Flames race along the benches, devouring tapestries, licking the walls as if drawn by hunger. The smoke thickens, rolling across the ceiling beams in heavy waves. Sparks fall like red snow. Outside, the night is all confusion, men tumbling into the drifts, coughing, covered in soot. The aurora glows faintly above the fjord-green ribbons twisting across the black sky. To the fleeing guests, it looks like the world's roof has caught fire. Inside, Halfdan refuses to leave. He kneels beside his brother, gripping the king's cold hand. Harold's eyes are open, fixed on nothing. Halfdan whispers a line their father once said, "Every ship sails twice, once through water, once through memory." Then he drags the body toward the doorway, coughing, his cloak smouldering. The quirky tidbit comes from one Icelandic fragment written a century later. It claims that as the fire spread, witnesses saw shapes moving in the flames, silhouettes of warriors rowing through smoke, their oars striking sparks, their faces calm as statues. The dead came for their king, the chronicler wrote, and he rose to meet them on a tide of fire. Outside, Sigtrygg staggers into the snow, his face blistered, his eyes wide with terror. The gods are angry, he gasps. The old seer follows him, clutching her bowl. She lifts it high toward the burning hall, shouting words that no one understands. The bowl glows red, then shatters in her hands. Halfdan finally emerges, dragging Harold's lifeless body into the open. The snow hisses as the fire's heat touches it, steam rising around them like mist from another world. He lays his brother down, gently brushing the ash from his face. "You wanted to burn brighter than the rest," he whispers. "Now look at you." Historians still debate whether the blaze was accidental or deliberate. Some suggest one of the guests, perhaps a rival chieftain, set the hall alight in the confusion after Harold's collapse. Others believe lightning struck, though the sagas insist no storm touched the sky that night. The fire's timing, they say, was too precise, too final. The survivors gather at a distance, faces illuminated by the inferno. No one speaks. The heat drives them back until the snow beneath their boots melts to slush. Above the crackling flames, the longhouse groans as the roof begins to cave. With a sound like thunder tearing through wood, the ridgepole collapses. Sparks rise in a golden fountain carried upward by the wind until they vanish into the aurora. Ristin, the Sami guide who came to trade gifts at the feast, mutters softly. The mountain has taken him. The sky eats the sea again. None of the others understand, but the words hang there heavy as prophecy. The seer sinks to her knees in the snow, her hair whipping around her face. He has gone where fire drinks salt, she murmurs, where the ship sails without wind. Then faintly smiling, she adds, he'll need a helmsman. Halfdan stares at the flames until his eyes sting. Then the gods can steer him themselves. The fire burns for hours. When the dawn comes, it reveals only a blackened shell. Steam rises from the ruins, mingling with the faint shimmer of the northern lights fading in the pale sky. Ravens circle overhead, silent for once. Archaeologists have since unearthed the remains of what may have been that very hall, a charred foundation near the old royal seat of Avelsnes dating to around 970 CE. The burn layer contains fused gold droplets, melted silver, and the outline of what might have been a high seat, evidence of a catastrophic blaze intense enough to liquefy metal. Halfdan and the surviving guests bury the king's body on the ridge above the fjord. They pile stones over him, forming a cairn that overlooks both land and sea. In the centre, they place the serpent emblem from his hall, blackened but intact. The amber eye, cracked by heat, still gleams faintly. When the last stone falls into place, Halfdan whispers, he always wanted to see everything from the top. As they turn away, the wind carries the scent of burned wood and honey. It smells like endings and beginnings. The mountain smokes for days. Travellers passing through the valley claim that at night, when the wind blows from the north, they can hear faint laughter echoing from the ruins. Some swear it's the creak of timbers settling, others the sound of oars cutting through unseen waves. Either way, the hall of gold and smoke is gone. In its place stands a memory one that refuses to cool, even under centuries of snow. By morning, the valley is a hush of ash and frost. The longhouse lies in ruin, charred ribs of timber poking through the snow, like the skeleton of a whale stranded on land. Smoke still rises from the embers, thin and grey, curling skyward, as if reluctant to let go. The wind carries the faint scent of pitch and burnt pine mingled with something stranger, old as salt again, though the nearest shore lies more than 20 kilometres and 12 miles away. Halfdan stands alone before the ruin's cloak, stiff with ice. His breath fogs in the pale light. He has not slept. His men linger further down the slope, muttering prayers, afraid to go near. A dozen corpses lie half buried beneath snow and ash, their shapes softened by the night's storm. Among them, the seer's body sits upright, frozen mid-gesture, her fingers still tracing a circle in the air. Then come the ravens. At first it is only one circling low, calling hoarsely, then another, and another. Within an hour the sky above the valley turns dark with wings. The birds settle on beam stones and even the cairn on the ridge. Their feathers shimmer blue-black against the pale dawn. They are silent now, watching. Halfdan exhales through his nose. Odin's spies, he mutters, "You've come for your report." A mainstream historical fact in Norse belief, ravens were sacred to Odin, god of wisdom and war. His two companions, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory flew each day across the world and returned to whisper what they had seen. Warriors took their appearance after battle as both omen and honour. Archaeological finds show raven imagery carved into helmets, banners and shields across Scandinavia, marking them as symbols of divine witness. Still, there are too many of them, hundreds perhaps. They crowd the sky and the ruins, hopping along blackened timbers, pecking at nothing as if expecting the dead to rise again. Halfdan steps closer, his boots crunching over the snow. "Go on," he tells them softly, "there's nothing left to take." A raven cocks its head at him and croaks a harsh metallic sound that echoes through the valley. More join in until the air itself seems to vibrate with their voices. The surviving men draw back, muttering charms, crossing their fingers in the old way. The quirky tidbit surfaces in later sagas that claim one raven larger than the rest, perched on the king's cairn that morning and spoke. The sea climbs the mountain, it supposedly said, and the mountain remembers the sea. No one wrote that down for another 100 years, of course, but it fit the legend too well to die. Halfdan closes his eyes. He feels the weight of it, the crownless kingdom, the hollow left by his brother's death. The feast meant to unify their rivals had instead scattered them like frightened children. Messengers would carry the tale before sunset, and by spring every petty lord from Hedeby to Trondheim would be sharpening knives for the throne. He turns to the men. We leave by midday. Burn what's left. A murmur of protest ripples through the group. It's already burned, one says. Then burn it again, Halfdan replies. Let no scavenger or sorcerer take what was his. Historians still discuss that command. Some interpret it as a symbolic cleansing, a final cremation to free Harold's spirit. Others see it as paranoia, an attempt to erase the evidence of a ritual gone wrong. The ruins excavated at Avaldsnes do show 2 burn layers, one from the first fire and another smaller from a deliberate torching later. The men obey, piling timber, tossing the remaining furs and broken benches into the pyre. The ravens lift as the smoke thickens, wheeling in slow, perfect circles. The sound of crackling wood fills the valley again, though the flames this time feel gentler, almost merciful. Halfdan watches, jaw clenched. May this be enough, he whispers. May he rest where even the gods can't find him. But even as he speaks, the wind shifts. The smoke twists downward instead of rising, curling around his boots. It smells of salt and honey. And faintly, within the roar of the fire, he hears a rhythm, 4 beats pause, 4 beats the same oar-stroke pattern that haunted the feast. He freezes. Not now, he says quietly. Not again. One of the warriors looks up, startled. What did you say? Nothing. Halfdan mutters, stepping back from the pyre. But his face has gone pale. He knows what he heard. The sound fades as quickly as it came, leaving only the crackle of burning wood and the hiss of melting snow. By afternoon the flames die down. The ravens return, dozens of them landing around the blackened cairn. They peck gently at the stones, then lift off one by one, flying west toward the sea. As the last bird disappears beyond the ridge, Halfdan feels something loosen inside him, a strange fragile calm. Take him home, then, he murmurs, if that's where he belongs. That night they camp by the fjord where the air smells clean, and the stars shimmer like ice chips scattered across black glass. The men fall asleep quickly, too tired to dream. Halfdan alone keeps watch, sitting beside the embers of their small fire. He pulls the serpent emblem from his pack, the one salvaged from Harold's Hall. It is still warm to the touch, though it should have cooled hours ago. The amber eye glints faintly in the firelight. When he tilts it, the reflection inside looks like a sail. Rest easy, brother, he says. The ravens will tell your story. A gust of wind rolls across the water. For an instant he hears it again, the steady, ghostly rhythm of oars striking unseen waves. But this time it sounds less like warning, and more like farewell. The fjord glimmers under the moonlight, calm and endless. Somewhere far beyond the sea breathes, and the ravens, black specks against the stars, fly on. By the second dawn after the fire, the fjord mirrors a dull grey sky, and word of the king's death has already travelled farther than his ships ever sailed. Messengers on horseback thunder through frostbitten passes, their cloaks stiff with rime, carrying news wrapped in panic and promise. Harold Fireborn is dead, his hall burned, his kin divided. Halfdan watches them go from the shoreline, jaw tight, the serpent emblem heavy in his gloved hand. Behind him the surviving warriors linger by their longships, unwilling to leave, unwilling to stay. No one says it aloud, but they all know the truth. Without Harold, the North will devour itself. The first of the claimants arrives before sunset. Hyrik of Lade, grey-haired and smiling too easily, rides into camp with a dozen men and a cart of gifts, barrels of salted fish, a chest of silver, and one magnificent drinking horn trimmed with walrus ivory. In memory of your brother, he says smoothly, and in friendship. Halfdan eyes the chest, then the man. You bring more silver than sympathy. Eric only shrugs. Both are useful in times like these. A mainstream historical fact: when Viking kings died without clear succession, their realms splintered fast. Power wasn't inherited by divine right. It was seized by whoever could persuade the most chieftains, marry the right widow, or swing the largest axe. The result was what the sagas call etta barni kinslaughter, the undoing of bloodlines through ambition. By the third night, 3 more friends arrive. One is Harold's cousin from the Danish coast, another a petty sea lord from the islands, and the third a priestly envoy carrying offers of Christian alliance. Each speaks softly of unity, but all glance at the cairn on the ridge, as if it were a throne waiting for a new occupant. Halfdan refuses every toast. He drinks water from a horn and keeps his sword across his knees. There will be no feast, he says not, while the smoke is still in the air. The quirky tidbit emerges from a later chronicle claiming that each of these visitors offered a token drawn from the ashes of Harold's Hall, a melted coin, a fragment of rune-carved beam, even a handful of the hall's burned soil proof that they too had shared in the ending. Historians suspect it was poetic invention, but it paints the mood perfectly, a court of ashes, each suitor clutching relics of ruin. That night, beneath a sky streaked faintly green by the returning aurora, Halfdan calls his men together. "You all swore oaths to my brother," he says quietly, "and you swore them by the gods who watched him burn. So I ask you now who still keeps faith silence." Breath steams in the cold. Then one warrior kneels, placing his palm on the frozen ground. "I do," he says, "by the sea and the sword." Another follows, and another. But not all. A dozen step back, eyes down. Halfdan nods. "Then you've chosen." Historians remain divided on what happened next. Some argue Halfdan executed the Oathbreakers that same night, an act consistent with Viking custom, where betrayal of sworn loyalty was punished by blood. Others claim he let them flee, knowing their cowardice would be punishment enough. The truth buried in ice and legend is probably both. Some escaped, some didn't. By morning, only 50 men remain at his side. He gathers them at the cairn. The ravens have returned, fewer, now circling lazily in the pale light. "This is the end of kingship," Halfdan says. "No more crowns, no more feasts. If the gods want rulers, they can pick from the dead." One of the younger men, voice trembling, asks, "What of the throne lord?" Halfdan glances at the burned ridge. Thrones melt too. A gust of wind sweeps down from the mountains, scattering ash across the snow. For a moment it looks like black petals falling from the sky. He turns to Eric of Lade and the others. "Take your gifts and go. Tell your people that the north belongs to itself again." Eric studies him for a long moment. "And if they come for what's left," Halfdan smiles faintly, "then the mountain can keep it." He orders the longships launched at midday. The sea is calm, green-grey, dotted with small floes of ice that glitter like shattered glass. As the oars dip into the water, the rhythm returns. 4 beats. Pause 4 beats, the sound that once haunted the hall, now echoing through real waves. The men row in silence, each lost in thought. Behind them, smoke rises from the ridge one last time, curling upward like the ghost of a banner. The mainstream debate still stirs. Scholars today, was Halfdan ever crowned? Some sagas call him Halfdan the Silent, suggesting he ruled briefly before vanishing from the record. Others claim he disappeared into exile, wandering east to serve the Kievan Rus. What's clear is that after his brother's death, the Norwegian coast fractured into rival jarldoms that would not unite again for nearly a century. As twilight deepens, Halfdan looks toward the dark horizon. No more feasts, he murmurs. No more kings. But in his heart he knows the truth that every survivor eventually learns that silence never lasts long, and the world always hungers for new rulers, new songs, new betrayals. Somewhere behind them a raven calls once more, its voice sharp and distant. The men keep rowing their oars, striking in perfect rhythm like a heartbeat the sea refuses to forget. Years pass as quietly as snowfall on stone. The valley where Harold's Hall once stood becomes a place of silence, visited only by herders and the occasional pilgrim drawn by whispers of the king who burned among his guests. The wind smooths the ruins flat, and what once was timber and gold sinks back into earth and memory. But stories like embers refuse to die. A century later, when traders from Iceland land at the fjord below Jotunheimen, they are told of a mountain that still smells faintly of salt after rain, though no sea has touched it for ages. The locals call it Sjöfjell, the Sea Mountain, and say that on clear nights you can hear the creak of oars beneath the ground. That's where King Harold feasted his way into legend, one old man tells them, and where his brother spoke with the gods in smoke. The chroniclers record the tale, reshaping it into verses and runes. By then facts have blurred like ink in snow. Harold Fireborn becomes Harold the Sky Sailor, who built a hall so magnificent that the gods grew jealous and struck it with divine fire. Halfdan becomes Halfdan the Silent, the mortal who refused Odin's gift of kingship. The mainstream historical fact remains that several runestones across southern Norway, especially the fragment known as the Vang Stone, bear inscriptions, eerily close in date and phrasing to the saga's events. One fragment even mentions a feast of flames for the Sea King carved in the late 10th century. Archaeologists argue whether it commemorates a real ruler or a poetic archetype. The line between truth and memory has long since frozen over. Halfdan himself vanishes from written record around 975 CE, but in oral tradition he never dies. Some say he sails east into the dawn seeking atonement across the rivers of the Rus. Others claim he becomes a hermit above the Arctic Circle seen decades later, wandering the snowfields muttering to ravens. The quirky tidbit appears in an Icelandic manuscript from 1250, which insists that a shepherd once found a carved bone near Avaldsson. On it, written in a spidery hand, were the words, "We sailed where clouds drink the sea. The mountain remembers us." The bone vanished soon after, taken by scholars or spirits, the monk notes dryly, but it lingers in every retelling that followed. In time, Christian scribes reframe the story into moral caution. The feast becomes a parable about pride and pagan arrogance. He raised a hall to the gods, one sermon declares, and the Lord burned it down to prove there is but one King of Heaven. The transition from saga to sermon strips the tale of blood and wonder, turning divine fire into divine judgment. Yet among the northern poets, the old tone survives. They sing of the Hall of Gold and smoke of the serpent emblem with its broken circle of the amber eye that gleamed like captured sunlight. The king who burned but did not drown, they call him the one whose oars beat time against the stars. Historians still disagree on whether these songs sprang from memory or invention. Some propose they evolved from a single real disaster, a chieftain's hall struck by lightning around 970 CE. Others suspect deliberate myth-making. The Vikings, ever aware of their own storytelling power, might have crafted tragedy from politics, wrapping rebellion and regicide in the cloak of divine mystery. Whatever the origin, the legend spreads. Skalds recite it in Iceland, in the Hebrides, even in Dublin's longhouses. By the 11th century, the feast that ended a reign becomes one of those tales every listener claims to know, though no two versions match. In some, Harold is poisoned. In others, the mead horn itself bites him. Some end with his spirit sailing across the aurora, others with the hall's ashes falling as snow on distant seas. And in every version, the same refrain echoes 4 beats, pause, 4 beats. The rhythm of oars, the heartbeat of the north, folded into the language of fire and loss. Centuries later, archaeologists unearth the charred timbers of an early medieval hall beneath layers of ice near the western ridge of Rogaland. They find melted glass beads, warped brooches, and a single pendant carved from amber, cracked but faintly translucent. Under magnification, they see something remarkable: minute traces of salt embedded deep within the fossil resin. Salt from seawater. It's a discovery that reignites the legend. Was the amber once worn by Harold himself? Was it the pendant found around the neck of the body buried beneath the keel, or just coincidence, one more mystery folded into myth? No one can say for certain. Museums display the pendant now under glass, its surface reflecting faint amber light. Visitors lean close and swear they can see movement within it, tiny swirls of brightness like ripples on distant water. The curator laughs them off, saying it's just refraction, but those who listen carefully claim they hear something else. A soft rhythmic creak, 4 beats, pause, 4 beats. The story endures because it never resolves. Every generation reshapes it. Scholars, poets, YouTubers, even bedtime storytellers murmuring through digital glow. What began as one night's disaster becomes a centuries-long echo, travelling through language the way sound travels through ice, muted, warped, but unbroken. Halfdan's cairn still stands on the ridge. The ravens still nest there in spring, their feathers catching light like black fire. Sometimes, after storms, salt crystals form in the cracks between stones. No one knows why. At dusk, when the aurora bends low and green across the sky, the villagers still tell the tale to children. "That's not wind," you hear they whisper. "That's the oars of the king's ship rowing between worlds." And for a fleeting moment, between science and faith, between bone and story, the listener almost believes. Winter deepens. The fjords freeze at their edges, and the mountains glow pale blue beneath long hours of twilight. The old hall's valley lies silent under meters and feet of snow, but the story of its feast refuses to sleep. It drifts through taverns, through monasteries, through fireside murmurs where truth and imagination blur like breath on glass. In one version told along the coast, Harold's spirit still holds a feast every solstice, his longship, rising ghost-like from the ice to host fallen warriors. The mead they drink tastes of seawater and smoke, and every cup toasts both victory and regret. In another version, His brother Halfdan never died at all. He wanders the north disguised as a sailor, listening for songs about his family's curse, carrying an amber pendant that glows whenever someone speaks his name. These stories grow like frost across the centuries, each crystal different, each reflecting another's light. By the time medieval monks begin recording the sagas on vellum, the tale of the feast that ended a reign has already split into a dozen threads. Some call it tragedy, others a miracle. But every retelling begins the same way: a golden hall in the mountains, laughter beneath a storm, and a cup raised to the gods who listen too closely. The mainstream historical fact remains that Viking feasts were the heart of social and political life. More than just revelry, they were, where kings negotiated treaties, poets earned their gold rings, and warriors bound loyalty with drink. Archaeological remains of feasting halls, Benziborg Ledgera, reveal immense hearths, imported glassware, even fragments of exotic spices like cinnamon and pepper. These were not crude banquets of bone and mead. They were power-made visible hierarchy carved into every seat and goblet. Yet the feast of Harald Fireborn has always stood apart. Historians studying the burned foundations in Rogaland note how the hall's structure differs from typical Viking designs, too high in its roof, beams too ornate for its region. Some wonder if it was built deliberately as a temple to Odin, disguised as a royal dwelling. Others whisper that its architecture mirrors descriptions of Valhalla itself, 500 doors each, wide enough for 800 warriors to pass through. Perhaps one scholar wrote they tried to summon heaven, and instead opened the wrong door. The quirky tidbit surfaces in a modern laboratory rather than an ancient manuscript. In 2011, Norwegian researchers analysing soot from the charred timbers found traces of honey barley and heather pollen fused together ingredients for mead. What puzzled them was the ratio far higher in honey than any known recipe. If these readings are correct, the lead chemist noted the mead they brewed could have been as potent as fortified wine, strong enough to fell a man after 2 cups. Strong enough perhaps to blur vision, to let hallucination masquerade as revelation. And maybe that's what happened. Maybe Harald's feast was simply too wild, too proud, too drunk on its own brilliance. Maybe sparks from a torch fell into spilled mead and the gods were never involved at all, is a theory that comforts skeptics, the mundane wrapped in mythic disguise. But then again, the science never fully explains the salt in the soil, or the missing body, or the way the ash layer pulses faintly under certain frequencies of sound, as if remembering rhythm. Halfdan's fate fades into half-truths, but one detail recurs again and again. Wherever he goes, he carries a small flask of mead from that final feast. He drinks a single drop each year to honour what was lost, and though centuries pass, the flask never empties. Poetic fancy, surely. Yet across Europe's sagas, the motif repeats the eternal drink that keeps memory alive not through taste but through time. Historians continue to debate what the feast really means. Was it the end of an age, the moment when Norse paganism gave way to Christianity's colder order? Or was it simply the story of a man who thought he could outdrink fate? Each argument loops back to the same paradox. How can a myth this vivid still shimmer with evidence buried under ice? Modern visitors hiking to the ridge where the cairn once stood describe strange sensations. Compass needles falter, radio signals fade. Some hear echoes like waves lapping beneath the snow. Others claim the air tastes faintly of honey. A few leave offerings, a coin, a splash of beer, a whispered toast to the king who feasted too far. Every year, when the northern lights ripple green across the sky, the villagers still pour a little mead on the ground for Fireborn, as they call him now. He lit the night once, they say. Let him rest warm. And perhaps that's what the story has always been, a warmth against cold time, a memory that keeps history breathing. Because in the end, every feast, whether in a Viking hall or a modern home, is a promise against forgetting. Cups raised, laughter, shared food passed hand to hand, all tiny rebellions against silence. When mead meets memory, the past rises like steam from winter, breath glowing for a heartbeat before fading back into night. As the tale winds down, picture the hall rebuilt in imagination, the gold gleaming, the torches bright, the air thick with the scent of roasted boar and pine smoke. Hear the low hum of voices, the clatter of cups, the faint rhythm of oars somewhere beneath the earth. The king raises his horn one last time, not in pride but in gratitude, and the gods, merciful for once, listen quietly. The wind outside softens. Snow drifts close the doors. Inside, the fire burns low and steady, its light the colour of old honey. The feast is over, the story told, but its echo remains a warmth that stretches across centuries, reminding us that even in loss there is something unbroken. And if tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you hear the soft creak of wood or the far-off pulse of waves, don't worry, it's only history rowing by. So now let the noise fade and the sea of time grow still. Imagine the longship at rest beneath its mountain of snow, the aurora folding gently across the sky, like the last page of an illuminated book. The ravens have gone home, the fires have cooled, the gods, if they were ever listening, have turned to dreams. Breathe slowly. The air smells of pine ash and old honey. In that quiet, you can almost feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath you, a rhythm older than kings, older than oaths. The story we followed tonight isn't really about death or revenge. It's about remembrance, about how humans carve meaning from chaos and find warmth, even in the coldest legends. As your eyes grow heavier, think of the mead horns clinking softly in the half-light of laughter, fading into sleep of the mountain exhaling through the snow. Let each image settle, like embers cooling into stars. Because somewhere beneath history's endless snowdrifts, the ice dragon of memory still glows faintly, reminding us that stories like fire survive by being shared. So rest easy now, traveller of the past. The feast is done, the oars are still, and the sea above the clouds is calm once more. May your own dreams sail smoothly through that quiet water. Good night.